I stood in my own kitchen holding a dish towel while my son threw a glass of red wine directly at my chest, and his wife laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not an uncomfortable laugh, a real one, like she'd been waiting for that moment for a long time. I was 63 years old. I had worked 31 years as a school librarian in Columbus, Ohio. I had buried my husband. I had raised my son alone for the last 12 years of his childhood, working double shifts in the summers so he could go to football camp, so he could have the right shoes, so he never once felt the absence of his father more than he had to. And I stood there, soaked in Cabernet Sauvignon, in the kitchen I had paid to renovate 6 months earlier, and I did not say a single word. That was the moment everything changed, not because I broke, but because something in me went very, very quiet. Let me go back to the beginning, because this story doesn't start with the wine. It starts 4 years earlier, when my son, I'll call him by what he was to me, my boy, the one I raised, married a woman named Celeste. I want to be fair. I tried to like her. I genuinely did. She was sharp, organized, and she made my son laugh in a way I hadn't seen since he was a teenager. When he called me to say he proposed, I cried happy tears. I told him I couldn't wait to have a daughter. I meant it. The first sign came at Thanksgiving, about 4 months after the wedding. I had driven up to their place in Cincinnati, a beautiful craftsman house, 3 bedrooms, a big backyard. My son had put a down payment on it the year before the wedding, but the deed was in both our names because I had given him $40,000 from the life insurance payout when his father passed. We had agreed, verbally, that it was a gift to help him get started. I never asked for anything in return. I never expected to. That Thanksgiving, Celeste asked me while we were both standing in the kitchen whether I planned to relinquish my name from the deed at some point. She said it the way you'd ask someone to pass the salt, casual, like it was already decided and I just hadn't caught up yet. I said I hadn't really thought about it. She said, "Well, you should, it creates complications." I let it go. I told myself she was nervous about having a mother-in-law. I told myself she was just very practical. I went home after Thanksgiving and didn't mention it to my son. The next 2 years were a slow erosion. Little things, mostly. Celeste would make plans for holidays and mention them to me only after flights were already booked. She'd refer to the house as our home in a tone that made clear I was not included in that our. When I visited, she'd sigh when I rearranged anything in the kitchen, even just moving a glass back to the wrong cabinet. My son noticed nothing. Or he noticed and chose not to see it. I still don't know which one is harder to accept. I moved in with them in October of the year I turned 63. That was my mistake, and I own it. My apartment lease had ended, and my son suggested it himself, said it would save me money, said the guest room was just sitting empty, said it would be nice to have me closer. Celeste was standing right there when he said it, and she smiled and said, "Of course we'd love that." I should have gotten my own place. I should have kept my independence. But I was tired after 31 years of working, and I was lonely in a way I hadn't admitted to myself yet. And my son was my son. So I moved in. Within 3 weeks, I understood that I had walked into something I wasn't prepared for. Celeste had rules, not written down, not spoken plainly, but understood. The way weather is understood. I was not to use the front door when her friends were visiting. I was not to join them for dinner when they had couples over, because it changed the energy. I was to keep my groceries on one specific shelf in the pantry and one drawer in the refrigerator. My son enforced these rules when Celeste reminded him to. When I tried to talk to him privately about it, he'd say I was being sensitive, that Celeste just liked things a certain way, that I needed to give her more credit. I gave her more credit. For 14 months, I gave her all the credit in the world. The night of the wine was a Saturday in December. They were having friends over. 4 couples, people from my son's work. I had made myself scarce the whole afternoon, stayed in my room, eaten a sandwich alone at 4 o'clock, like I was a child being kept out of the way. Around 7, I came down to get a glass of water. That was it. That was my transgression. I walked through the kitchen to get a glass of water. My son was at the counter opening another bottle of wine. Celeste was talking to a woman by the window. When she saw me, she stopped mid-sentence and said, loud enough for the room to hear, "Honestly, can you just, not right now?" I said I was just getting water. And my son who I had held through every fever, who I had driven to school every morning for 6 years after his father got sick, who I had watched graduate college from the 3rd row while I cried so hard I fobbed up my glasses, my son set down the wine bottle, looked at me, and said, "Mom, she asked you nicely. Go back upstairs." Something cracked open in my chest in that moment. I think it was the word nicely. She had not asked me nicely. She had dismissed me in front of 8 people, but he had rewritten it in real time, standing right there. I turned to go, and I don't know what expression was on my face. Maybe something he didn't like. Maybe just the plain fact of my hurt. But before I reached the doorway, he picked up the open bottle and poured it. Didn't throw it exactly, just tilted it toward me. A long, deliberate pour across the front of my blouse, my mother's blouse, cream-coloured with small pearl buttons that she'd given me the Christmas before she passed. The room went silent, and then Celeste laughed. I walked upstairs. I closed my door. I sat on the edge of the bed, and I held my own hands in my lap, and I breathed in and out for a long time. I did not cry. That surprised me. I thought I would cry. Instead, I felt something settle inside me, the way a house settles after a long storm. Quiet, a little cold, very clear. I pulled out my phone, and I called my sister in Louisville. She picked up on the second ring. I told her what happened. She said, "Come here, tonight." I told her I wasn't ready to leave tonight. She said, "Then tell me when." I said, "Give me 2 weeks." She said, "I'll be ready." I want to tell you what I did in those 2 weeks, because it matters. It wasn't revenge, not in the way people use that word. It was more like inventory. I started with the facts. The house was in both my name and my son's name. I had the paperwork in a folder in my suitcase, where it had been since I moved in. Old habit from my husband, always saying, "Keep your documents close." I called a real estate attorney in Columbus the following Monday, a woman I'd used years before for my husband's estate. I told her the situation. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You have full co-ownership rights. He cannot sell or refinance without your signature, and neither can you without his. But we have options." We talked for an hour. I took notes in a small spiral notebook with a blue pen. Option 1 was a partition action, a legal proceeding where co-owners who can't agree ask the court to divide or sell the property. It takes time, she said, but it's clean. Option 2 was simpler. If I was willing to sell my interest to a third party, and if I could find a buyer for my half, I could initiate a buyout situation that would essentially force a sale or a resolution. Given the neighbourhood, given the market, given that the mortgage was already 60% paid down, she told me my share of the equity was substantial, more than I'd expected. I said, "How long would option 2 take?" She said, "If we move quickly and your paperwork is in order, we could have something in motion within 10 days. I said, "Let's move quickly." Those 10 days were the strangest of my life. I kept my routine. I made coffee in the morning. I kept my groceries on my shelf. I said good morning to Celeste when we crossed paths, and she gave me her usual half nod, the one that meant she'd acknowledged my existence without having to commit to it. My son and I did not discuss what had happened. He never apologized. I didn't expect him to. Once, in the second week, he came to my room doorway and said he hoped I wasn't making things weird. I looked at him for a long moment. This man who had his father's eyes and his father's hands and had somehow become someone I didn't fully recognize. And I said, "I'm not making anything weird." He nodded and left. On a Thursday morning, 12 days after the night of the wine, I signed the final documents. My attorney had found a real estate investment group that purchased co-ownership interests as part of a larger portfolio strategy. They were prepared to buy my share of the equity at a negotiated price, which would trigger a formal partition process. It meant my son would ultimately have to either buy out my share at fair market value or agree to a full sale of the property. Either way, he and Celeste would not simply get to keep the house and continue on as if nothing had happened. I want to be honest about how I felt when I signed those papers. I sat in my car in the parking lot of the FedEx office in Cincinnati, having just dropped off the notarized documents, and I held the steering wheel with both hands, and I felt, I don't know how to explain this exactly, I felt like I was standing up straight for the first time in 14 months. Not triumphant, not angry, just upright. I called my sister. I said, "I'm coming today." She said, "I've already made up the guest room." I drove back to the house at noon. My son's car was gone. He worked Thursday mornings at the office before working from home in the afternoons. Celeste's car was in the driveway, but she left for her yoga class every Thursday at 12:30. I had noticed this about her schedule, the way you notice the habits of a household when you've been made to feel invisible in it, involuntarily, because there's nothing else to pay attention to. I had packed gradually over the previous 10 days. A bag here, a box there, moved to my car in the evenings when they were watching television. It's remarkable how little you accumulate when you've been living like a guest in someone else's home. My real belongings, my furniture, my books, the good dishes my mother left me, were in a storage unit in Columbus. What I had at the house fit into 4 bags and a small banker's box. I loaded everything into my car in 2 trips. I left one thing behind, not by accident. There was a framed photo on the small table in my room, the one I brought when I moved in. It was a picture of the 3 of us, me, my son, and his father, taken at the lake house in Michigan the summer before his father's diagnosis. My son was about 16. He had sunscreen on his nose, and he was laughing at something off camera, and his father had his arm around my shoulder, and I looked so entirely happy that sometimes I could barely look at it. I took the photo out of the frame. I put it in my purse. I left the empty frame on the table. I drove to Louisville without stopping. My sister lives in a small yellow house near the Highlands neighborhood. The kind of place with a deep front porch and a vegetable garden and neighbors who wave from across the street. She was waiting on the porch when I pulled in. She came down the steps before I'd even turned off the car. She put her arms around me in the driveway, and I stood there and let her hold me, and that was the first time I cried since the whole thing started. We sat on the porch until it was dark, drinking iced tea and not saying very much. She didn't ask me what I was going to do next, or whether I was going to try to reconcile with my son, or what Celeste was going to say when they found out. She just sat with me the way sisters do when they understand that what you need first is simply to be somewhere safe. He found out 4 days later. His attorney called mine. My son called me twice, both times while I was on my sister's porch watching the birds at the feeder, and I let both calls go to voicemail. The first message was angry, his voice tight and clipped, telling me I had no right, that I'd done something legal but wrong, that I needed to call him back and fix this. The second message, left 3 hours after the first, was different, quieter. He said he didn't understand why I hadn't just talked to him. He said he knew things hadn't been great, but he didn't think it was this bad. He said, "Mom, please." I listened to both messages twice. I did not call back. I want to address something directly, because I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking, what kind of mother does this? What kind of mother uses a legal mechanism to force the sale of her own child's home? And I understand that question. I asked it of myself at 2 a.m. more than once, lying in my sister's guest room listening to the neighborhood go quiet. Here is what I came to. I had given my son $40,000, which I will never see again and never ask to see again. I had lived in his home for 14 months, during which time I had been systematically made to feel like an inconvenience, a problem to be managed, a presence to be minimized. I had been spoken to with contempt, excluded from my own family, and on one specific December evening had red wine poured on my mother's blouse in front of 8 people while my daughter-in-law laughed. Not once had he apologized. Not once had he called to say, "Mum, I shouldn't have done that." What I did was not revenge. It was a boundary finally, after 14 months of having no boundaries at all. And it was the only language that seemed to exist in that house. Not words, not conversations. Property. In the weeks after I left, I started to build things back. My sister helped me find a small apartment near her, ground floor. 1 bedroom, a courtyard in the back with a magnolia tree that the landlord said bloomed pink every April. I signed a 1-year lease. I bought a second-hand reading chair the color of rust, and I put it by the window, and every morning I sat in it with my coffee and watched the courtyard and thought, this is mine. This small, quiet thing is mine. I got my belongings out of the Columbus storage unit with help from 2 of my sister's neighbors, who loaded everything into a rented truck on a Saturday morning while her husband made biscuits. My books went on shelves. I assembled myself following the instructions twice because I've never been good at furniture assembly, and I was not going to have them fall. My mother's dishes went in the kitchen cabinet. The lake house photo went on the windowsill. I looked at it for a long time the day I put it there. My son, 16, sunscreen on his nose, laughing at something I can't remember now. His father's arm around my shoulder. My own face, so happy. I still love him. I want to be clear about that because I think sometimes when women tell stories like this, the love gets lost in the telling and people assume the point is the anger. The point was never the anger. The point is that I was 63 years old and I had spent 14 months making myself smaller and smaller in a room I had helped pay for, and I finally stopped. Do I miss him? Yes. In the way you miss a version of someone that may not exist anymore. I miss the boy who used to fall asleep on the couch watching football, who would eat 3 bowls of my turkey chili without stopping, who called me from college the first time he was homesick and tried to pretend he wasn't. I miss that person. Whether that person and the man who poured wine on my mother's blouse are the same person. That's something I'm still working out. His attorneys and mine reached a resolution 3 months after I left. He bought out my share. The amount covered my moving expenses, the cost of the new apartment's first and last month's rent, and left enough to pad what I call my starting over fund. Enough to breathe. Enough to not have to ask anyone for anything. He sent me a letter, an actual paper letter, about a month after the settlement. He said he was sorry. Not for everything. Not for the wine. Not by name. But he said he was sorry that things had gotten so bad, and that he hoped I was doing all right, and that he thought about calling me a lot but didn't know what to say. I read the letter 3 times. I put it in the drawer of my nightstand. I haven't written back yet. I don't know if I will, or when. The women in my family tend to take our time with things like forgiveness. Not because we're hard-hearted, because we're honest, and I'm not ready to offer something I don't fully feel yet, even to my own child. What I know is this. I am not waiting for him to give me permission to be at peace. I stopped waiting for that on the evening I signed those papers in a FedEx parking lot in Cincinnati, holding the steering wheel with both hands, sitting up straight. The magnolia in my courtyard bloomed pink in April, just like the landlord said it would. I sat in my rust-colored chair with my coffee and watched it through the window for a long time. It was one of the most beautiful things I had seen in years. I keep coming back to the wine-stained blouse, not because of the humiliation, though that was real, but because of what I did after. I folded it. I set it on the chair. I sat on the edge of the bed and I breathed, and I didn't scream, and I didn't beg, and I didn't fall apart. That stillness surprised me. I think it surprised me because for a long time I had confused keeping the peace with having no peace at all. There's something that happens when you spend years making yourself smaller for someone else's comfort. You start to believe the smallness is just who you are. I believed that for 14 months in that house in Cincinnati. I ate sandwiches alone at 4 in the afternoon. I used one shelf in the pantry. I came downstairs for a glass of water and understood from a sigh that my presence was an inconvenience. And I told myself I was being gracious. I told myself that was what a good mother did. But grace given from fear isn't grace. It's surrender. And the things I was surrendering, my name on a deed, my right to walk through a kitchen, the simple dignity of not being soaked in wine while someone laughed, those weren't small things. I had just let them feel small for so long that I'd stopped seeing them clearly. What I did in those 10 days after, calling the attorney, understanding my legal rights, making a plan quietly and carefully while continuing to say good morning over the coffee maker, that wasn't coldness. It was, I think, the first genuinely clear-headed thing I had done in years. I had to think honestly about what had happened, what my actual rights were, what I was willing to accept going forward, and what I was not. That kind of honesty is harder than it sounds. It requires you to stop excusing people you love. It requires you to look at the facts without the softening filter of hope. My son was capable of what happened that December night. That is a fact I had to sit with, not a monster. I don't believe in monsters, I believe in choices, but a man who had made choices, one after another, that led him to pour wine on his mother's blouse and walk back to his guests. And I had made choices too. The choice to stay silent, the choice to keep giving, the choice to wait for an apology that was not coming. When I finally acted, I acted within my rights, with an attorney, through proper legal channels. I did not yell. I did not destroy anything. I did not ask for more than what was already mine. What I did took steadiness, the kind that doesn't come from anger, but from finally deciding that your own life is worth protecting. The partition process, the settlement, the drive to Louisville, none of that was easy. It cost me my relationship with my son, at least for now. That is not a small cost. I want to be honest about that. There are mornings I pick up my phone and I think about calling him. Not to argue, not to revisit anything, just to hear his voice. I put the phone back down. Not because I don't love him. Because love without boundaries was what got me to that kitchen in the first place. What I know now, living in my apartment with my rust-colored chair and my mother's dishes and the magnolia that bloomed pink in April, is this. The life I have now required me to be 3 things I was not, for a long time, willing to be for myself. Honest about what was happening, brave enough to act on that honesty, and strong enough to keep going once I did, even when it hurt, even when the voicemails came, even when I missed him. Those 3 things, the willingness to see clearly, the courage to act rightly, and the endurance to hold on, they were always in me. I just had to stop giving them away.